Hello, my friends. I want to share a story with you today. It's called A Quilt for Mr. Mac. It's about a little girl named Kate who wants to help her grandmother make a quilt for a special friend. Kate came into her grandmother's sewing room, and for a moment she couldn't see her grandmother because of all the piles of fabric. "What are you doing, Grandma?" asked Kate. Well, Grandma laughed. "Looks like I've made quite a mess, doesn't it? I'm sorting my fabrics for a project I have in mind. Do you want to help?" Well, Kate loved to sew with her grandmother, and right now it was hard to see the sewing machine with fabric here and there. "Well, what can I do?" asked Kate. "You can help me sort," said Grandma. "I'm looking for fabric that will look patriotic. Can you guess what that might be?" "Well, red, white, and blue," said Kate, "and maybe stars and stripes." Well, Grandma looked at Kate and said, "Do you remember a few months ago I made a quilt of valor? Do you remember what I told you about it?" "I remember," said Kate. "You said that the quilt was going to go to a veteran who had served our country. You said it was a way to say thank you for what he had done, and you gave it to a man at your church. Are you going to do that again?" Well, Grandma nodded, and Kate said, "Mom says you have a giving heart." Grandma smiled. "It does feel good to give to others. You've been practicing your sewing, and I thought that maybe you would like to help me sew this one. Would you?" "Oh, yes," said Kate. "I want to help." "Good," said Grandma. "We will have to start by finding 9 pieces of fabric that look nice together." "Red, white, and blue," said Kate as she picked up a piece of red fabric. Grandma and Kate spent the rest of the afternoon sorting piles of fabric and laying them side by side until they had the 9 pieces that looked the best together. Kate also found some fabric with stars. A few days later, Kate was back in her grandmother's sewing room. Grandma had been busy getting things ready, and there were 9 different fabrics all cut into squares so that Kate could begin to sew. Well, Grandma showed Kate how to sew the pieces together to make one block. Each block would have 9 different fabric squares in it, and a block made this way is called a 9 patch. Kate would have to make many 9 patches before they could sew them together for the quilt top. Kate had a special sewing machine that she used at Grandma's house. It was just the right size for her. And very carefully, Kate took 2 pieces of fabric and put them with the pretty sides together. Then she sewed them with a straight seam. Well, Grandma noticed that Kate was quiet as she worked and wondered what Kate was thinking about. "A penny for your thoughts," she said. "What are you thinking?" Kate looked at her grandmother and asked, "Who's going to get this quilt?" "I don't know," said Grandma. "I think we should give it to someone who lives in our town. What do you think?" Well, Kate didn't hesitate. "I would like to give it to Mr. Mac," she said. Well, Grandma smiled and nodded at Kate. Mr. Mac lived next door to Kate, and was a very special friend of hers. Mr. Mac was elderly, but as a young man he had served in World War II. Mr. Mac always seemed to have time for Kate, and she loved to help him in the garden. He taught her about the plants and even about the insects in the garden, and she would sit on his porch and read to him. They were very special friends. See them up there in the porch swing? Grandma and Kate finished sewing the blocks that day, and instead of sewing the blocks into rows, Grandma had a surprise for Kate. Grandma took one of the blocks and cut it through the middle. She cut right to left and then top to bottom. Kate couldn't believe what she was seeing. They had worked so hard to put all the pieces together, and now her grandmother was cutting them apart. "Grandma," said Kate, "what are you doing?" "Well, we're going to mix things up a bit," said Grandma. "Mr. Mac deserves to have a very special quilt from you, and I'm going to cut each of these blocks into 4 smaller blocks, and then we will sew them back together." Grandma explained, "I think you will like the blocks even better, all scrambled up." "Scrambled eggs," laughed Kate as she and her grandma put the blocks up on the design wall. They turned the blocks in different directions, making changes as they went along, and finally it was just the way they wanted it. It was a few days before Kate could come to sew again, and she was in tears when she arrived. Mr. Mac hadn't been feeling well and now was in the hospital. "I'm sure he'll be better soon," said Grandma. "Let's work so we can finish his quilt." First they sewed the blocks together, then they sewed the blocks into rows, and then when the rows were joined, the quilt top was finished. The day they finished the top, Kate's good news was that Mr. Mack was back home. A few days later, Kate was back to help with the quilt. She had visited Mr. Mack at his house. He was in a wheelchair and was very glad to see her. She was going back the next day to read a story to him. It was time to layer the quilt. Grandma had a big piece of fabric that was going to be the back side of the quilt. They laid it flat on the table and put some white fluffy filler called batting on top of the backing. Then they laid down the pretty quilt top. They used lots of safety pins to hold the fabrics together. It took a long time to do the pinning, and Grandma called it a quilt sandwich. Grandma told Kate that their project wouldn't be a quilt until it was quilted. That meant that Grandma had to join all 3 of the layers together using her sewing machine. It would take her several days to do this quilting. Kate's job for the next few days would be to spend time with Mr. Mack. When Grandma finished the quilting, Kate came back to help sew on the binding. The binding is what covered the edges of the quilt, and the last part of this job was done by hand. They were also going to make a very special label to sew on the back of the quilt. The label would explain who was receiving the Quilt of Valor and who made the quilt. See, if you look closely, you can see Mr. Mack's name. And then where it says pieced by, that'll have Kate's name and her grandmother's name, and then quilted by her grandmother. Kate said, "Mr. Mack has a birthday in a few days, and a lot of family are coming. Could we give him the quilt on his birthday?" Well, Grandma thought that was a good idea, and she would talk to Mrs. Mack about it. "You need to think about what you're going to say when you give the quilt to Mr. Mack," Grandma told Kate. It was hard to find the right words, but Kate wrote a few ideas on a piece of paper, and soon she knew what she wanted to say. Well, the words she wrote: service, honor, quilt, comfort, and love. The sun was shining for Mr. Mack's birthday party, and after family and friends had eaten the picnic lunch, Mrs. Mack told the group that Kate had something special for Mr. Mack. So Kate was nervous as she carried the quilt to Mr. Mack, who was sitting in his wheelchair. He smiled at her, and she took a deep breath. "Mr. Mack," she said, "you are my special friend, and I've made a quilt of valor for you to honor you for the service that you gave our country in World War II. Thank you, and I love you." Well, everyone clapped, and a few people had happy tears in their eyes. Mr. Mack's eyes were wet, too, as he opened up his beautiful quilt. He reached out and gave Kate a big hug. "Thank you," he said. "You are my very special friend, too." Later, when Kate and Grandma were alone, Kate said, "Grandma, I'm sorry I forgot to say that you helped make the quilt. I'll be sure Mr. Mack knows you worked on it." Well, Grandma gave Kate a big hug. "I'm sure he knows you had some help, Kate, and I'm so proud of you. I think you have a giving heart, too." There they are, and that is the end of the story. So what I want to tell you, too, remember the 9-patch block? Well, here's one. It has 9 patches. And then what happened? They took a 9-patch and they cut it apart. See, there it went, all in pieces. But then it got put back together again, and look, a completely different design. So you can think about this. Sometimes in our lives we think we have everything all together, and it's all in a nice, perfect 9-patch. And then sometimes things go to pieces. Maybe our plans didn't go quite like we wanted them to. Maybe we didn't do well on a test. Maybe that goal you were kicking toward in your soccer game didn't quite go in the net. But then, if we ask God to help us put all those pieces back together, look at what can happen. They can all get put back together in a design that's even better than it was when we started. So try to remember that, and that when things seem to be going to pieces, all you have to do is ask God to help you put them back together again. Okay? So just remember, I miss you, I love you, and I can't wait till we're back together again. Y'all take care.